In the autumn of 1841, in the quiet coastal townships of New England, a case emerged that unsettled even the most hardened locals, not because of a gruesome murder or a robbery gone wrong, but because of something far stranger. A man named Henry Wakefield was buried not once, but twice. His death was marked, witnessed, and recorded, yet weeks after his funeral, he appeared to return, walking the muddy streets at night, knocking on doors where he once did business, speaking in a voice neighbors swore was his own. Imagine attending a funeral attended by dozens, only to see the same man alive again in your town square 3 weeks later. Imagine the ripple of terror that would spread in a God-fearing community where the boundary between life and death was not just sacred, but absolute. For the citizens of coastal Massachusetts in 1841, this was more than a mere ghost story. This was a living paradox, an event that confounded physicians, ministers, and magistrates alike. What they uncovered in the months that followed threatened to shatter their understanding of faith, mortality, and the very definition of death itself. This is not a tale told around campfires to frighten children. This is a case that left behind records, letters hidden in family Bibles, diary entries from ordinary townspeople, and buried newspaper clippings now fading in forgotten archives. The case of Henry Wakefield, the man who died twice, remains one of New England's most haunting mysteries. A story that forces us to ask whether the line between life and death is as sharp as we believe. Before we begin, make sure you subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss these hidden histories and forgotten mysteries. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from. It's always fascinating to see this community stretch across the world as we piece together stories most of history has struggled to explain. Today we step into the shadowy streets of 1841 New England to witness a man's death, his second death, and the legend that has never truly been laid to rest. The first record of Henry Wakefield's death appears in a modest town ledger kept by Reverend Nathaniel Brewer of Essex County, Massachusetts. Dated October 12, 1841, the entry is brief and written in the clipped hand of a man who recorded more births and deaths in his lifetime than sermons. Henry Wakefield, age 38 years, departed this earthly life at the hour of 9 in the evening after a sudden and violent illness, interred October 14th. Such notes were common, stark and unembellished. No preacher needed to linger on death in the 19th century. It visited often enough without flourish. And yet, the story did not begin neatly at that ledger mark, nor did it end there. People in the village remembered Henry as neither remarkable nor infamous. He was not the sort that gossip clung to, though his name was known in local shipyards. He had come of age in an era when the whaling trade, shipbuilding, and merchant shipping fueled entire towns. His occupation as a clerk for a Boston mercantile partner was steady if unglamorous. He traveled, sometimes weeks at a time, between the docks of Salem, Marblehead, and Boston. By all accounts, he kept careful ledgers, sober language, and company limited mostly to other businessmen. But the most peculiar thing about Henry Wakefield, even before the bizarre events of that autumn, was his constitution. Neighbors whispered that he had always been pale, sometimes faint, often withdrawing from long conversations, as though his body lagged behind his mind. Some suggested a weak heart. Others wondered aloud if the vapors, or consumption, as tuberculosis was then called, lingered in him, though never visibly advanced. Whatever the truth, his frailty did not prevent him from keeping work until the week of his first death. It was a Tuesday evening when Margaret Ellis, a spinster, seamstress who lived 2 doors down, swore she saw Henry collapse on the steps outside his boarding house, clutching his side as though stabbed. She roused neighbors, and 3 men carried him inside. Witnesses said his face had taken the color of candle ash, and that even as local physician Dr. Ezra Cummings bared his chest to check for breath, it seemed life had already fled. Dr. Cummings later described him as cold, fixed, with no perceptible pulse. He pronounced Wakefield dead within minutes. By custom, the body was tended through the night by neighbors who laid it in a pine coffin and set candles at each corner in a vigil. In New England during this time, death was familiar, but not without fear. Families often insisted on several days of watchfulness, partly to honor the deceased, partly to make absolutely certain death had indeed come. The phrase "saved by the bell" itself, from safety coffins fitted with strings to prevent premature burial, reflected how deep the fear of mistaken death ran. Wakefield was watched through 2 nights. His landlady, Mrs. Lydia Kettle, later told correspondents that at no time during those hours did the corpse stir. The coffin was closed on the morning of October 14th, borne by 6 pallbearers to the parish yard, lowered into its appointed earth, and covered in stones and soil with prayers. Town registers mark his funeral as attended by the common number. But it was what followed, not what preceded, that shocked. 17 days later, on the edge of dusk, a journeyman named Elias Potter was walking home when he saw a man crossing Tremont Street in Salem, his figure familiar but out of place. Potter swore that in the dim lamp glow he recognized Henry Wakefield. Thinking he must be mistaken, he hastened home. Yet 3 nights later, 2 sisters who had ridden from Marblehead to visit kin insisted they had heard a voice at the tavern doorway calling for Mr. Samuel Barrett, Henry's trade partner. The voice, raspy but recognizable, asked for an account, to be settled. The sisters had known Henry by sight for years and claimed to their dying days that it was certainly he who had spoken. The stories multiplied. A dock worker, a schoolboy, the widow of a weaver, all spoke of glimpses of Henry walking, sometimes speaking. Not ghostly, not translucent or flickering like folklore specters. Whole, solid, absolutely himself. The consistency of these accounts rattled the community, for none of the witnesses were eccentrics or prone to wild stories. Each seemed sincerely disturbed and convinced. And then came the undeniable moment. On November 3rd, less than 3 weeks after he was buried, Henry Wakefield appeared at the door of his former lodgings just after supper time. His landlady opened it, pale as sheets, nearly collapsing when she saw him. She screamed so loudly that neighbors rushed over. And there, standing awkwardly in the candlelight, was the man they had carried in a coffin. His hair disheveled, his eyes shadowed, his hand holding the same walking stick last seen beside his coffin. Suggestions after the fact claimed some trickery. Perhaps it was a cousin or a twin never known. But no records of such kin existed, and every villager who saw him identified him as Henry himself. He spoke haltingly to those gathered. "I have been away, and it was not the grave, though it may yet take me." His words were remembered, because they terrified, not defiant, not mad, but spoken as if by someone caught between. Dr. Cummings, the same physician who pronounced him dead, was summoned in disbelief. His testimony survives in letters. Wakefield's pulse beat faint, but present. His skin was warmer than on that October night, but carried a chill, not of fever, but of winter air. The physician wrote that Henry's heart seemed irregular, his breathing shallow, but he was unequivocally alive. Rumors ignited. Some proclaimed miracle, others whispered demonic possession. Ministers argued in private whether resurrection, outside the biblical canon, could occur. Still others said Wakefield had never truly died, that he had suffered a trance or swoon mistaken for death, though this explanation faltered under the insistence that his body had lain cold, waxen, breathless, watched for days. Henry himself offered little clarity. In the following week, he remained sheltered indoors, visited by clergymen and curious townsfolk alike. When pressed, he only said, "I was taken," and then returned. He refused to name where he had been, though one minister claimed Henry whispered to him of dark corridors, voices in languages I could not know, and a promise broken. The minister's diary, discovered later, contains perhaps the most chilling phrase attached to the affair. His eyes, when he said it, bore no resemblance to a man who dreamed. By mid-November, news had traveled rapidly through coastal Massachusetts. Papers in Boston carried short columns about the man who returned from the grave in Salem. Letters flew into Salem requesting confirmation from anyone who had seen him. In a time when science clashed constantly with superstition, the Wakefield case became a conversational battleground. Physicians argued that coma, catalepsy, or even narcolepsy-like seizures might explain it. Clergy read it as a caution to repentance, and common neighbors whispered that the devil had slipped a counterfeit among them. For Henry, however, The return was brief. Less than a month after being seen again among the living, his health worsened dramatically. Witnesses described him as both weaker and strangely composed, as though awaiting something appointed. On December 9, 1841, Mrs. Kettle, the landlady, found him dead once more in his bed. This time several physicians examined him, cutting the vein of his wrist for blood, holding a mirror to his lips, pressing needles beneath his fingernails. All tests pointed grimly to finality. He was buried again on December 11th. On his gravestone, chiseled still to be seen among weathered names, are the words, Henry Wakefield, born January 1803, died October 12, 1841, died again December 9, 1841. The Lord knoweth his own. This epitaph alone inflamed discussion across the region. Few gravestones in American history carried such words. Some religious authorities denounced it as blasphemous. Others insisted it was the most honest record possible. The townsfolk, still uneasy, left it untouched, as if chiseling the truth into stone, both sealed and exorcised it. And yet, as is so often the case with mysteries, even that was not the end. For years after, scattered accounts suggest Henry was encountered once more. A diary from 1847 kept by a traveling minister records that, in Ipswich, a stranger joined an evening sermon, his face eerily familiar, his clothes old-fashioned, his manner silent. When asked afterward who he was, the man gave no name, only the word Wakefield. Skeptics call this invention or coincidence. Believers argue the second burial had not contained enough soil. What is inarguable is the effect on the town. Salem and its neighbors had long danced with legend, witches, portents, unexplained deaths. But Henry Wakefield's case unsettled even those who dismissed the old witch trial lore. For what haunted them was not an invisible specter, but a man of flesh and bone, whom they had kissed farewell in a coffin, and who somehow returned. This is where our investigation truly begins, not with ghost tales whispered in alleys, but with ledger's testimony, gravestone records, and the unnerving trail left behind by Henry Wakefield. How do we explain a man who died twice? Was it misdiagnosis, a medical anomaly, or did New England witness something far stranger, a crack in the boundary between life and death? Stay with me, because as we enter Section 2, we will peel back those letters, examine the archives, and trace Henry's life before the coffin. And what emerges is a man whose history was not so plain as the clerks made it appear, a man whose connections hint at secret societies, old world practices brought from Europe, and events that make his double death less a miracle and more a grim inevitability. But before we continue, take a moment to subscribe and tap that bell icon, because these are exactly the stories we're keeping alive on this channel, the hidden case files no one else is telling with their full depth. And tell me in the comments, if a man you buried returned to knock on your door, would you speak with him, or would you lock the door and pray? The records will not let us look away, and neither will the story of Henry Wakefield, the man who died twice. To understand the shadows that fell over 1841, we must begin decades earlier, with the boyhood of Henry Wakefield. Unlike many who arrived in coastal Massachusetts from distant ports, Henry was not foreign. He was born in Ipswich, a town older than the Republic itself, clothed in salt air and whaler's musk. His father, Thomas Wakefield, was a stout figure remembered for his trade in timber and tar. His mother, Sarah, was of quieter repute, known mostly for her needlework and for insisting that her only son was a thoughtful boy, who spoke more with his eyes than with his tongue. Records from parish schools list young Henry as average, prone to faint spells during warm afternoons. Teachers noted his unusual precision. In arithmetic, he rarely made mistakes, yet when pressed to explain how he found answers, Henry only muttered that they came into his head all at once. Some wrote him off as bright, others as peculiar. What is noteworthy in retrospect is how often Henry seemed to exist on the border of faintness, swooning when startled, pale even among the pale. At a time when consumption scourged families, Henry's constitution troubled his parents. At 13, he collapsed during a sermon. Farmers carried him home, and the minister declared it God reminding us that he holds life between his fingers, like a quill. Henry recovered but walked slower thereafter, as though the world required more of him than of others. By his 20s, Henry apprenticed with a shipping merchant in Salem. The Wakefield home was modest, and schooling beyond parish. Arithmetic cost dearly, so apprenticeship offered both wage and training. Merchant ships were lifelines in New England's vital coastal trade. They carried flour, sugar, molasses, and cloth. But they carried something else: sailors. And among sailors traveled stories, superstitions, and secrets from the ports of the Caribbean, from Morocco, from the windswept coasts of Europe. It was in the taverns of Salem that Henry encountered men who spoke of rites practiced at sea. Sailors shared tales of blood oaths whispered before voyages, charms scraped into planks beneath masts, and rituals intended to keep a ship safe from storms. Some sailors called them foolish remnants. Others swore by their power. Henry listened, more than he drank, learning not the songs but the cadence of the stories. Family correspondence housed in the archives of the Essex Institute reveals one unsettling letter from his mother, dated 1824. In it she writes, "Henry is much absorbed, of late with foreign tongues, repeating combinations of sounds over his ledger well into night. He says they keep his mind sharp. I fear they are not prayers." No one at the time thought much of it, but read now beside the mystery of 1841. It suggests young Henry had already begun straying into curiosities beyond arithmetic. By 1828, his apprenticeship formally ended. He continued to work in Salem under merchant Samuel Barrett, who would later defend him as trustworthy, precise, and without debt. The two formed a bond akin to brothers, yet several unsettling anecdotes clung to Henry nonetheless. One night, while tallying ship manifests, he collapsed suddenly across the ledger without warning. Bystanders thought him dead, even stiff. But moments later he gasped, sat up, and muttered in a flat voice, "I was not gone, only beneath." They chalked it to exhaustion, but gossip remembered. A darker thread emerges from a court record in Marblehead in 1831. A burial society, a community fund for funerals and widows, held a hearing after claims that Henry, entrusted with certain accounts, had warned members not to enter one Joseph White too hastily, for his spirit lingers longer than his breath. This drew suspicion. Who was Henry to declare delays in burial? Physicians resented his interference. Eventually, accusations passed, but the comments lingered, and villagers noted how Henry seemed irrationally obsessed with confirming death. It is no accident he lived in an era obsessed with it. Across New England, the early 1800s saw the rise of resurrection men, body snatchers who sold corpses for medical study. Tales of premature burial rattled every coastal churchyard. Newspapers serially advertised coffins with mechanical signals, bells, flags, springs. The terror of being buried alive soaked into the soil, and Henry Wakefield, frail, swooning Henry, was precisely the kind of man folks imagined might inspire such a story. By his mid-30s, Henry had never married. Suitors found him polite, clean, articulate, but emotionally distant. He conversed as though half listening to something upon his shoulder, one woman recounted. In 1839, parish minutes record Henry suffering another delirium of faintness while walking from Ipswich to Salem in cold weather. A farmer claimed Henry lay still for minutes, rigid, unbreathing, before startling awake and insisting he continue walking. These patterns alone, faintness, trances, intermittent collapses, could suggest a neurological illness, catalepsy, epilepsy, perhaps cardiac arrhythmia. Modern science might explain. But in 1841, Salem, such tidings cultivated whispers of a man favored by death, courted by shadows, or marked by providence. Thus, when Henry collapsed in October of that year and Dr. Cummings announced him cold, the community did not doubt. Every feint Henry had endured prepared them, primed them to accept that this time, at last, he had failed to rise. What unsettled them was his return. Let us pause and consider the details carefully. The coffin, according to records, was sealed on October 14th. 6 men carried it, 3 of whom left written testimony in later years when asked by the Essex Chronicle about the case. Each swore to have both seen and felt Henry's stiff body. His lips, one noted, had darkened blue. Another remembered the odor of stillness. None considered him alive. 2 nights of vigil preceded interment. If Henry had been in mere suspended animation, surely some stir of life, some twitch or murmur would have erupted in those days of watching. None reported it. And yet, scarcely. 3 weeks later, Henry Wakefield returned, pale but animate, shuffling through Salem streets like a man recalled. One chilling suggestion emerges when examining local seafarers' lore. Among the diaries of Captain Elias Norton, a sailor who frequented Salem docks, there is an entry dated 1837 referencing Henry by name. H.W. studies the sailor's tongue of the dead. He says there are words to bind the body, words to stay, the spirit before it crosses the threshold. Though cryptic, the phrasing implies Henry might have been dabbling with charms intended to resist death's final claim. Superstition, yes, but when placed beside his double demise, suddenly haunting. Neighbors described that after his return, his manner changed. He was reserved before. Now he was otherworldly. His voice faltered, rasping, brittle. A child who encountered him in November 1841 ran shrieking home, declaring, "His eyes were like no man's eyes, but as if glass covered them." Adults whispered similar things in more measured tones, that his expression no longer matched flesh, that he blinked too rarely, that his heartbeat stammered irregular like a broken clock. Such perceptions might be exaggerations of fearful minds. Still, even Dr. Cummings could not reconcile his own senses. His notes read, alive but diminished, pulse faint, inconsistent, warmth present but unnatural. I cannot explain except that the grave rejected him. This phrase alone, "the grave rejected him," circulated widely and endured in regional lore. There is one further, more disturbing clue. In the final weeks before his second and ultimate death, Henry was said to be writing something in a small, leather-bound journal. Though never recovered, one witness swore she saw pages filled with overlapping letters that formed no English words. Jagged, alien, like maritime codes, but stranger. Whether this was delirium of a failing mind or some final attempt to record what he had seen when away remains an unsolved puzzle. Let us imagine for a moment how overwhelming this cycle would be for a small 19th century town. They had buried one of their own. They had accepted his death. Churches had rung their bells. And then there he was again, knocking on doors, speaking the names of men who had already closed his grave. What if this had happened in your own community today? What if a man you wept for and buried walked back into the bar 3 weeks on, ordered a drink with his same voice, left coins on the table in the same manner? Would you treat him as saved or as tainted? This question, left unanswered, roiled Salem in 1841. It is here, in the cusp between science and superstition, that we locate the enduring fascination of Henry Wakefield. If his case were isolated, it might be dismissed as rumor spun into legend. But when examined alongside other phenomena recorded in New England at the time, corpses found exhumed with hearts removed to prevent posthumous contagion, strange practices brought by immigrants from Central Europe, even hysteria stirred by color, a pattern emerges. A pattern of profound fear that perhaps death is not as absolute as tombstones suggest. In Section 3, we will unravel some of those patterns, tracing folkloric echoes, ritualistic practices, and deadly epidemics that intertwined with Henry's case. You will see how much his story aligns not just with medical anomaly, but with a deeper cultural dread of the dead who do not stay buried. But before we shift further along that path, take a second to subscribe to this channel if you've not done so already. We are piecing together cases like Henry Wakefield's one by one, and your support keeps this archive of forgotten mysteries alive. And tell me this, if you were the physician summoned to the tavern that November night, and your own hands once wrote the death certificate, what would you believe? That you had been wrong before, or that something impossible had occurred? The answer may lie not only in Henry Wakefield's grave, but in the shadows of countless other graves across 19th century New England. By the time Henry Wakefield's story reached the Boston newspapers, the wider public had already been primed to see omens in tales like his. This was the age of the burial panic. From the 1780s until the late 19th century, accounts of premature burial haunted every corner of the Atlantic world. Europe was littered with grim anecdotes. Men found clutching the insides of their coffins. Women exhumed with shredded fingers and twisted faces as though they had clawed for light. These stories circulated not just as rumors but in official reports and sermons. New Englanders, bound by religious severity but also by maritime trade, imported such anxieties right alongside their flour and gunpowder. The public fear was so common that by 1820, several inventors had marketed devices called safety coffins. These contraptions ran from the occupant's hand up to a mechanism above ground. If the sleeper awoke alive, a tug sent a bell ringing, a flag rising, or a pipe whistling. Graveyards in Boston and Connecticut experimented with keeping watchhouses, where men stood guard for days, listening for cries beneath the earth. The case of Henry Wakefield was the nightmare version of that fear. Not only a man buried, alive, but a man buried, confirmed dead, vigil kept, and yet appearing alive again weeks later. It was the whispered superstition made public, undeniable. Folklore from Europe offered many lenses through which to see such a return. The Germans spoke of the Nachseher, ghouls who rose not as ghosts, but as weakened, wasted bodies, feeding invisibly upon the living kin until stopped. The Irish feared revenants, who walked abroad bringing calamity. The Romanians passed down tales of strigoi, restless corpses who returned in near-human form. When northern immigrants crossed into coastal Massachusetts, they brought their grave dreads, and Wakefield's reappearance fit too neatly. It is telling that some of Henry's neighbors, rather than hail a miracle, whispered at once that he had turned revenant. The symbol cut deeply into Puritan soil. A man touched by rot who walked again was a sign of judgment. Diaries of the period reveal such discomfort plainly. Minister Jonathan Green recorded, "If it is Henry returned, then let us tremble. For whom God delivers once to death, rarely does he restore. If he restores, it may be unto damnation." These were words chosen carefully, but their meaning radiates fear. Let us not forget, too, the long heritage of Salem itself. Half a century earlier, the witch trial legacy left wounds upon memory. The soil of Essex County bore the weight of superstition, trial, and state-sanctioned panic. If witches were feared as agents of unseen powers, what then of men who rose twice to walk among kin? The Wakefield case touched that bruise, and it throbbed loudly. Accounts make clear that after his resurrection, Henry was not greeted universally with warmth. A child fled his gaze. Shopkeepers avoided his steps. Neighbors crossed the street to bypass the man they had already buried. Imagine the terror, to greet someone whose departure to eternity you had witnessed, and yet see him reach out a hand again. More than awe, there was disgust. Life after death seemed not simple blessing but contamination, and yet others saw signs of providence. One elderly widow, Dorothy Pike, told her minister aloud, "Perhaps God spares him that we may learn patience. Perhaps his soul is delayed as a warning." For a people steeped in sermons about hellfire, the temptation to read spiritual lessons in every anomaly was strong. The double death was parsed in pulpits with more fervor than funerals. Physicians at the time scrambled for explanations. Catalepsy, a condition where the body grows stiff, breath shallow, pulse faint, was the favorite theory. Cataleptics could appear waxy, even corpse-like, and remain suspended for hours, occasionally days. Reports from France and Germany in the era describe more than a few mistaken burials traced after the fact to cataleptic fits. Could Henry have lingered in such a state? Could his body have cooled under vigil, his breath too faint for crude stethoscopes of the 1840s? Perhaps. But skeptics argue that 2 days of wake-keeping, 2 corpses' washes, and a doctor's hand on a vein should have sufficed. Furthermore, Henry himself admitted he had been taken elsewhere. This testimony complicates a biological explanation. If it were simple fainting or coma, Why would he describe corridors and voices in strange tongues? Was it delusion, the brain's dream in oxygen-starved collapse? Or was it exactly what neighbors feared, a mind that crossed a threshold and half returned? Such questions make fertile ground for memory, and the Wakefield episode soon drew parallels with other cases whispered in New England's lore. In Connecticut, 30 years earlier, exhumations of supposed vampires had been carried out after families fell sick. Tuberculosis was not yet well understood. Villagers wrongly concluded the dead family member consumed the living from the grave. They would dig up corpses, find them strangely undecayed, and remove the hearts or burn remains. Journalists recorded these rites, appalled but fascinated. Against this backdrop, Henry's reappearance seemed not a unique miracle, but an omen confirming such practices' necessity. "If the dead may walk, then indeed they may consume us," wrote one Boston columnist. Another piece of context lies with fraternal secret societies, which flourished in the early 19th century. Masonic lodges dotted New England, layering ritual mystery over everyday trade. Some critics of the Wakefield affair noted that Henry spent long evenings with sea captains known to host strange rites after voyages, mixing folk incantations with fraternal codes. Was Henry himself inducted into experiments of trance, suspension, or resurrection? The evidence here is wispy, but diaries and logs hint at influences beyond orthodox church walls. Folklore often builds upon coincidence, but the Wakefield case was too tangible. A gravestone inscription, a physician's embarrassed testimony, townsfolk too numerous to dismiss, and as more linked it to European Revenant traditions, the more the story rooted itself into the soil of collective dread. Imagine for a moment being present at that second burial. Mourners stand shivering in icy December air. Some have tears, from grief, others from terror. They lower into earth the man they had seen buried already. Do they whisper psalms? Or do they whisper questions? Will we see him rise again at Christmas? At spring thaw? If he returned once, what bars his return? Again? Here lies the linchpin of retention in this tale. The case is unresolved. Henry died again, yes, but the permanence of that second death remains always in doubt. And because of that, the legend wiggles free, resisting finality. The echoes continued long after. Sermons invoked him. Schoolchildren dared each other to step to his stone at night. One farmhand claimed to see dirt unsettled on the grave, fresh as if turned at dawn. Another said he watched footprints leading away that stopped after 6 paces. Unverifiable, perhaps, but in folklore, suggestive enough. Modern scholars weigh the event as a supreme example of premature burial myth. They argue Henry's condition aligned exactly with cataleptic disorders. They cite the fervid atmosphere of burial fear, contamination fears, and epidemic anxieties. In this view, witch trial Salem plus safety coffin Boston was bound to produce a Wakefield tale sooner or later. But local residents in 1841 were not scholars, they were families. To them, the man who died twice was no metaphor. He walked in candlelight, he knocked on wood, and he unsettled belief systems carved in stone, and perhaps even more unsettling. His story bore resemblance to another whispered case in Rhode Island, 2 decades later, when the Brown family exhumed their daughter Mercy and concluded she had returned from her grave. There they burned her heart to free her siblings from her hold. If Henry Wakefield's neighbors had been more superstitious, might they have dug his coffin again? Might they have set his body to the torch? The fact they did not is curious, perhaps because shame of being wrong a first time, perhaps because fear of what more such disturbance might summon. So what do we believe? Was Henry an anomaly of medicine? A man whose heart froze twice into stillness only to restart before ceasing again? Or was he a revenant, a living echo of old-world fears imported on ships, embodying death's half-open door? In Section 4, we will turn to the evidence left behind. The newspaper columns, the minister's letters, even a fragment of testimony hinting that Henry himself confessed knowledge of the Revenant legend days before his final end. Prepare yourself. The lines between fact and folklore blur more with each testimony. But before we continue, give this video a like if you're immersed in the mystery so far. It lets us know to keep digging deeper into cases no one else dares cover fully. And tell me, if you lived in 1841 Salem, would you have trusted Henry's return as providence? Or would you have called for his coffin to be opened once more, just to be sure? Because the people of his town never reached agreement. And therein lies the lasting chill. When confronting a mystery rooted in the mid-19th century, speculation is easy, but records are precious. And in Henry Wakefield's case, fragments do survive. Glimpses of parchment and columns that force us to reckon with what neighbors dared to write. Take, for example, the Essex Register from November 1841, just 3 weeks after Henry's first burial. In a small block of print between notices of livestock auctions and soap advertisements appears a peculiar note. It is related in the town of Salem that a gentleman, long thought gone, has lately been seen walking after due burial. Some call him Wakefield. The matter causes great stir. Note the phrasing, due burial. This was not rumor of a missing man, but confirmation that the funeral occurred. For such a paper to even mention it meant the story was spilling wide, beyond whispers into print. Then there are handwritten diaries, personal records that were never meant to entertain but preserve the fever of those months. Revered among them is the diary of Minister Green, whose entries we touched earlier. One line stands out from December 3rd, days before Henry's final death. This afternoon I visited Wakefield at the Kettle House. He spoke little. When I pressed him for testimony, he answered, "I'm not sure if I live now. It is colder. Each time." This I leave here for truth, though it condemns the limits of our knowledge. That stark phrase, colder each time, is unlike common fevered rambling. It reads like the measured despair of one who felt life diminishing. Further testimony comes from Margaret Ellis, the seamstress who had first seen Henry collapse in October. In a letter to her cousin, she wrote, "He looked like stone cut from body, the eye still, the lips gray. Yet after all things, he returned. I will say I saw him after. I held his hand. It was like leather, unwarmed. He spoke my name, but so faint that it frightened more than comforted." Her words remind us, this was not ghostly absence. This was touchable, physical, and disturbingly real. But perhaps the most chilling fragment comes from the physician himself, Dr. Ezra Cummings. After Henry's second funeral, Cummings reportedly confided privately to colleagues in Boston that he feared misdiagnosis. A letter held in the Massachusetts Historical Society archives, dated January 1842, and signed with his initials records, "I am haunted by the matter of Wakefield. I did not err the first time, yet he did return, and when he did, the pulse that once beat proud was as though drawn from another source. His flesh had no right to hold it." This was not the cautious writing of a boastful doctor covering failure. It was the confession of a man confronted with something beyond his anatomy charts. All these records overlap in their unease. Few doubted Henry truly ceased once, but twice. To be pronounced so, buried so, and then seen again, these documents suggest that even hardened professionals and cautious ministers could not dismiss it as error alone. Let us now consider Henry's own speech. Brief though it was, neighbors recounted phrases given weight because of their ambiguity. He told his landlady, "It was not the grave, though it may yet take me." He told Minister Green, "I am not sure if I live now." And according to one dock worker whom Henry allegedly visited at night to return an owed coin, Wakefield murmured, "Keep this, so you may swear I stood before you, if I am not tomorrow." Each phrase is both confession and riddle. Did Henry know he was drifting away? Did he understand he had crossed a threshold others could not? Or did his frail body interpret its cataleptic seizures in mystical language because no other framework existed? There is one final piece of tantalizing evidence. In the 1890s, half a century after the affair, a scholar compiling Curiosities of New England claimed to have seen a fragment of Henry's supposed journal, the one neighbors said he filled with strange symbols. The scholar described the pages as covered in rows upon rows of interlocking letters, Greek shapes mingled with hash marks like sailors' codes. Most chillingly, he reported one legible phrase written in English amid the confusion: "Life can be paused." Whether this fragment ever truly existed remains debated. The scholar's own book admitted he never obtained more than a glimpse. But if genuine, it would suggest Henry himself articulated an understanding of his uncanny suspension. He did not see it as miracle. He saw it as pause, a haunting choice of word. Consider the psychology here. If you believed deep in your bones that you were not fully alive, would you welcome conversation? Would you force a smile at neighbors? Or would you linger silent, writing cryptic notes, as Henry did? His reticence, far from arrogance, may have been conviction, that he was liminal, neither living nor gone. This interpretation aligns with the cultural dread of revenants. In folklore, revenants seldom speak at length. They answer curtly, avoid sunlight, resent questions. Henry's behavior, halting replies, withdrawn glances, his refusal to elaborate, matches that archetype uncomfortably well. Now remember, this occurred in an era of unsteady medicine. Physicians had no refined stethoscopes, no electrocardiograms, no true comprehension of cardiac arrest. Death was blurred. People feared it precisely because science was inadequate, and theology filled the gaps. In that environment, the testimony of even one man walking after burial would dominate nightmares. Yet Henry's case rose higher than anecdote precisely because of documentation. The gravestone itself is proof enough. No family chisels died, twice without bitter cause. Each letter, still carved in lichen-streaked granite, testifies to the truth of perception, regardless of the explanation. By December 1841, the vigilance of the community shifted from awe to unease. He had returned, weakened, estranged. He had offered cryptic remarks, and then, as though fulfilling prophecy, he died once more. Was it relief? Perhaps. Yet journals suggest his second death did not soothe. It intensified uncertainty because finality remained in question. Some believed he would rise a third time. Others swore nightly they heard knockings near his grave. This is where human psychology becomes central. Fear feeds repetition. The community began to overlay every cough, every missing traveler, every flickering candle with Wakefield's presence. The man who died twice was no longer simply Henry. He was contagion of thought, a narrative virus infecting Christians trained to fear damnation. As decades passed and memory turned into legend, rationalists insisted his condition was medical. But the voices left behind resist reduction. They speak of cold touch, of eyes gone glassy, of words heavy with otherness. And if they embellish consistently. So what do you believe? Was Henry's fate a cruel trick of physiology? Or was he a revenant in truth, New England's own brush with the hungry dead? Because even if we extend science's explanation, the timing unsettles us still. Buried 2 days, under watch, with multiple witnesses, awakened after 17, silent for 3 weeks, and then ceased again. Variation of seizure cannot account wholly for ritual language. Trance does not carve, life can be paused. These contradictions sustain his legend. In Section 5, we will examine how Henry's story shaped public response, how communities elsewhere began hosting their dead with new rituals, how newspapers invoked him in debates over safety coffins, and how even skeptics admitted that the Wakefield affair could not be erased. More disturbingly, we will confront testimony that even after his second burial, glimpses of his figure persisted into the 1840s, sightings that stretched belief past breaking point. But pause here for a thought. If we say he erred only in health, if he was simply weak-hearted and prone to fits, then why did neighbors carve his anomaly in stone? Why preserve shame forever on his grave? Unless they feared a mission left the door open. Unless to write "died twice" was to keep vigilance eternal. Before we continue, hit subscribe so these forgotten mysteries rise again in your feed, not buried to silence, but awakened like Henry Wakefield himself. And comment below, do you favor science or superstition in this case? Because whichever side you choose, You will be haunted by questions the other cannot answer. When the coffin of Henry Wakefield was lowered for the second time in December of 1841, neighbors in Salem and Ipswich believed, or perhaps simply prayed, that the matter was closed. But history shows that the burial was only the beginning of a new phase, the slow transformation from tragedy into legend, from whispered scandal into a cultural phenomenon. Within weeks, newspaper writers across Massachusetts seized on the affair. The Salem Gazette ran a coy column at year's end. It is said that one Henry Wakefield, having twice gone to his grave, may now rest in peace, although the good citizens debate still whether he ever fully belonged to the living at all. The Boston Evening Transcript pushed harder, publishing a longer feature in January 1842 titled "The Man Who Died Twice." Their language was half amusement, half warning, but it cemented Henry's story into wider New England consciousness. Some citizens resented the attention. A petition from several church leaders begged editors to cease trumpeting morbid curiosities that turned a man's misfortune into sensation. But it was too late. The hook was irresistible. The phrase "died twice" wielded the paradox that headlines crave. Once in ink, it spread like electricity to neighboring states. Letters from Connecticut, New Hampshire, and even as far as Virginia survive, each repeating curious accounts of the miraculous Salem clerk who would not stay buried. And the story mutated with distance. In Worcester, tavern tellers twisted the tale into one of Wakefield clawing his way from soil with bleeding hands. In New Bedford, the fisherman's version claimed Wakefield haunted the docks by lamplight, warning sailors of storms. The further from Salem his legend traveled, the more monstrous details heaped onto it, evidence of how quickly folklore grafts itself onto fact. But closer to home, the story's impact was less theatrical and more practical. Families began demanding longer vigils over their dead. Salem's undertakers noted that certain bodies were kept 3, sometimes 4 days before burial. Families unwilling to risk the humiliation or the horror of another Wakefield circumstance. Grave watchhouses saw renewed attendance. Men posted with lanterns each night beside cemeteries in case another voice rose from below, and there was another consequence: the revival of interest in safety coffins, already a minor industry. Salem's blacksmith Edward Tillinghast advertised a Wakefield bell in spring 1842, a coffin tool that allowed the occupant, if still living, to ring. It sold in small numbers, but the advertisement paints the truth. Henry's case drove commerce, profit carved from fear. Folklore scholars note carefully how Wakefield's tale slid into the broader panic about premature burial across America in those years. The culture was primed to receive exactly this sort of example. The boundaries of life and death seemed thinner then, made porous by crude medicine and sharp superstition. Henry was no longer just a man. He was a symbol of that porosity. Yet what turns the knife deeper are the scattered accounts that his presence lingered still. In March 1842, months after the second funeral, a woman visiting a relative in Ipswich wrote in her diary, "At dusk, a figure passed me on the lane, tall, thin, face ashen, eyes sharp. I greeted him, but he gave no word. Only later did my cousin whisper, 'That was Wakefield, or what remains of him.'" Again in summer 1843, a farmer from Danvers testified that a man resembling Henry asked him for water during harvest. The farmer obliged, but later swore the cup never drained. Water touched by lips that left it full. When pressed for details, the farmer grew pale and refused further speech. By 1845, even the ministers had begun to fold these stories into their rhetoric. One sermon preserved in Salem's congregational records warns, "Think not death avoided is salvation. For even if providence alloweth a man to return, it may be for terror, not for gift." Without naming Henry outright, the meaning was plain. But these alleged sightings carry more than dread. They evidence a community grappling with trauma. Salem, already shadowed by its witch trial legacy, found itself again trapped between rational defense and supernatural fear. And in that struggle, Henry became an archetype, a character rather than just a man. His frailty, his collapses, his journals all became props in a story retold until no clear boundary separated evidence from omen. What makes the legend more sinister is that some said Henry himself expected this cycle. His strange phrase to the minister, "It is colder each time," suggested not one pause, but many. Not a freak once repeated, but a condition, an affliction with rhythm. If true, then his second interment was not final. It was merely a longer pause. That idea alone was enough to keep villagers watchful, scanning shadows for a man meant to be long under soil. The intersection of fear and faith also widened. For some, Henry represented God's warning to delay burial, to respect the thin thread of breath. For others, he was evidence of infestation, proof of contamination by old-world revenants. A pamphlet printed in Boston in 1844 warned against Salem's ghoul, urging stricter exorcising rites at funerals. Though sensational, it underscores that Henry's case bled into theology and public debate alike. Even decades later, around 1870, older residents spoke cautiously when his name surfaced. The gravestone became an object of macabre pilgrimage. Schoolchildren dared each other to touch it after sundown. Two local boys swore the stone was always cold, colder than the others, even in summer. One wrote that when he placed his ear upon it, he heard faint scratching. Such youthful exaggerations, perhaps, but testimonies they remained, retold far outside Essex County. The story reached Europe through reprinted columns, where it joined the continent's own obsessions with premature burial. A London broadsheet reprinted "The Man Who Died Twice" as an American curiosity, alongside narratives of vampires in Wallachia. That context deepened the resonance. No longer just Salem's scandal, it had become an international caution about life's fragile measure. But at the core remains the central riddle, Henry's own awareness. Did he know what he was? His journal, maybe authentic, hinted yes. His words to the minister suggested yes. His haunted gait, silent and withdrawn, indicated he carried knowledge he dared not speak. And if so, what knowledge? That he was still dying? That he lived by some unnatural intervention? Or that he was already claimed and loaned back only for a little while, a loan that had run out in December? This ambiguity explains why the story continued for generations. People clutch at certainty, yet Henry offered none. Science struggled to explain. Folklore eagerly explained too much. Between the two poles, the story survives, empty of closure, ideal for repetition. And if you ask me what chills most, it is the gravestone. Stone does not exaggerate, stone does not gossip, yet there it is. Died twice. That inscription. Alone is a frozen headline, a reminder that whether revival or revenant, Salem believed Henry was not simply dead once. And when stone bears witness, legends endure. In Section 6, we will confront the most unnerving part of this puzzle, alleged third and fourth sightings decades later reported in Boston, and the possibility that Henry Wakefield became more than a single man, that his tale merged into urban legends of travelers seen along New England roads well into the late 19th century. Was it Henry? Was it someone else wrapped in his myth? Or was it Salem's conscience, doomed to replay its own fear upon the next pale figure in the mist? But before we continue, remember to share this story if it's gripping you as much as the neighbors it unsettled in 1841. Stories like Henry's deserve to be remembered not as curiosities, but as warnings. And let me know in the comments if you saw him in Ipswich Lane, face like ash, voice a rasp. Would you stop and offer greeting? Or would you run and never return that way again? Because the truth is, some in New England claimed they did see him, again and again. And those stories are the most disturbing of all. For most families in Essex County, Henry Wakefield's story slipped eventually into silence. People moved on, industry surged, the Civil War loomed in the distance. Yet scattered, like embers hidden in ash, came reports suggesting Salem's clerk was not as buried as his gravestone promised. In 1852, a Boston stagecoach driver wrote in his log that, traveling the Newburyport Turnpike late one fogged night, he was hailed by a thin man on the roadside. The man's face seemed pale, even against the moonlight. When asked where he traveled, The stranger replied, "I have walked from Salem, and I must walk further." The driver, uneasy, noted how the figure wore clothing 20 years out of style, and a hat I had seen only in ledgers of older fashions. What unsettled most was his final remark. "It grows colder each time." The same phrase, almost word for word, as Reverend Green had recorded from Henry in 1841. Skeptics dismiss this as coincidence. Perhaps the driver read one of the sensational columns and imagined his encounter. But true or not, the tale ensured that Henry's legend migrated from coastal ports to inland roads. A decade later, another unsettling account emerged from Providence. A merchant staying at an inn recorded in his diary that, while dining, a silent guest took the bench beside him. The innkeeper introduced the man tersely as Mr. Wakefield. When asked from where he came, the guest answered only, "From beneath." The merchant recalled terror freezing him so completely he left his meal untouched. Even well into the late 19th century, references resurface. The folklorist George Avery, compiling testimonies in the 1880s, wrote that old men of Boston still whisper of a figure pale as ash that walked among them in the 40s, and that some say was seen as late as 72, though his stone in Salem proves him 3 decades gone. We must pause here and ask, were these encounters genuine sightings of Henry himself? Or were they the unavoidable echo of legend? Humans see what they fear to see. Once a story lodges itself in communal memory, it becomes lens and shadow both, projecting itself upon the next weary traveler with a gaunt face. In this sense, perhaps none of the witnesses lied. Perhaps they truly did see Wakefield, because in their minds he remained alive, walking always at the boundary between grave and street. But why Henry? Countless men in New England fainted, sickened, or died strangely. Why did his case, among so many, survive? The answer lies in structure. His death was documented, his vigils were recorded, his reappearance was seen and touched, and then he left behind a gravestone that immortalized contradiction. That was all his legend required. Facts enough to anchor belief, uncertainty enough to spark eternal debate. A paradox chiseled into stone. From a psychological frame, the Wakefield affair tapped into 3 primal terrors: the fear of premature burial, the fear of spiritual corruption, and the fear of betrayal by mortality's boundaries. For most, death is final. It allows grief to be absolute. Remove that assurance, and you rob the living not only of their dead but of their faith in permanence. Salem's trauma was not Henry's frailty, but Henry's refusal to stay gone. We can see the ripple of his story in cultural shifts. After Roe, 1841, diaries in several towns note families insisting on mirrors placed before noses, pins driven beneath nails, hearts pricked before burial, crude, desperate tests to ensure the grave received only the truly dead. Salem's undertakers began recording, kept out longer for certainty. Henry's name was seldom written, but his shadow drove every act. Even in literature, echoes appear. American Gothic writers of that mid-century period often referenced specters who walked through buried. Did Poe hear Henry's tale? We cannot know, but the thematic kinship is uncanny. The premature burial, the fainting man who returns, the steady horror of uncertainty, all align. Henry's death may have been Salem's specific wound, but it pierced nerves across the continent. Accounts persisted even into the 20th century. A 1904 article in the Boston Globe revisited strange graves of New England and included Wakefield as curiosity number 3, calling him the gentleman clerk who claimed life departed and returned once more, but could not anchor it. By then, the frightening immediacy had softened into grim oddity, entertainment for readers eager for spook lore rather than spiritual caution. Yet the reprint kept him alive. For us, what remains is neither joke nor pure dread, but fascination. A man died and was witnessed again. Whether through physical anomaly or supernatural breach, Henry Wakefield's tale insists that life is not quite ours to measure. And that is why, 180 years later, we tell it still. The man himself, meanwhile, rests in that graveyard in Salem, his stone darkened by storms and moss. If you visit, you will see the weathered inscription, "Died twice." Tour guides in town, more accustomed to witch lore, sometimes walk visitors to it as a side curiosity. But those who pause longest are not the thrill seekers. They are those who stand silently, staring, as if trying to reconcile in their own mind whether the man inside lies truly still. Some insist the grave radiates chill beyond the others. Rationalists call that suggestion power of expectation. Superstitious guides swear their lamps sputter there more often than elsewhere. Curious teenagers, bold on dares, whisper into the stone asking, "Do you walk still?" and claim to hear faint shifting beneath. No proof is offered, yet the persistence matters. It means Salem has not unlearned the lesson Henry pressed upon. Do not be certain of death. Think now on the question I must leave with you. What frightens more, that Henry did indeed return from the grave by supernatural means, proving our laws of life fragile, or that he never returned at all, and that fear itself, was enough to convince dozens of witnesses they had touched, spoken with, and watched a corpse walk? Which is more terrifying, a world where death can be undone, or a world where human belief can so vividly manufacture the impossible? For my part, I suspect Henry was caught between. His frail body carried an affliction doctors had no words for, delivering him into trances both mistaken for death and worse, trances that convinced him of his own departure. He believed he had 1 foot beyond. He lived not in life, but in dread of dying, and dread is contagious. When he spoke of cold in corridors, he infected others. His 2 deaths became a story all of us now carry, repeating as if we too must keep vigil. And here lies the power of Henry Wakefield, the man who died twice. His mystery binds each listener into watchman duty, daring us to doubt, daring us to question the absolutes we beg for when our loved ones close their eyes. Salem's grief became New England's caution, and New England's caution has become our fascination. So when you next walk alone at dusk, when fog presses against lamps and the road seems too quiet, imagine the shuffle of steps behind you. Imagine a voice, weary and cold, speaking words centuries old. "I have been away, but not in the grave." What would you do? Run? Confront? Or admit that not all who are buried remain buried? Because if the tale is true, Henry Wakefield may still be walking. And if it is not true, then he lives in us, conjured by the very act of telling, refusing final death the way only legends can. If this story unsettled you, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone else who loves mysteries that refuse. Easy answers. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Was Henry Wakefield a victim of disease, or was he truly a revenant in New England's midst? Above all, subscribe and stay with this channel, because tonight we close Henry's coffin again. But tomorrow night we open another. And remember, some doors once opened are never closed.